Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Mike has indicated, this is the panel on the science policy interface, scientists communicating with decision makers. We have a terrific group of experienced panelists this morning, people who have a variety of experiences and expertise to share with us. I'll be introducing each of them in a moment, but let me make some opening remarks from the outset. Much like the other panels, we're going to invite each of the panelists to make very short opening statements. They will be 7 minutes in length. And then we would like to reserve plenty of time for interaction with all of you. So be primed and be thinking of questions that you would like to ask to initiate a discussion. And we anticipate spending most of the time with this interactive mode. At the very end, I will ask each of the panelists to do some very, very brief summary remarks. And then we're going to carve out 5 minutes at the very end of the session and invite Niall MacDonald to share with us the Rome Declaration, which is a statement on behalf of the European science community on the next major priorities for seas and ocean research. As most of you know, I'm a scientist, but I've also had the opportunity to serve as a decision maker, so I've sort of seen what we're going to be talking about this morning from both sides. And I can tell you that most decision makers that I know, especially policymakers, and this is politicians as well as career agency officials, make decisions based on a wide variety of considerations. For a politician, for example, decisions will often be solidly grounded in politics, but also in economics and in values. There are a number of things that feed into those decisions. It's my strong belief that science should also be at the table. But I think that we shouldn't fool ourselves that science and scientific information is going to dictate any particular outcome. It should inform those outcomes. And that is to say that all of those other elements of the decision-making process are always going to be there. Our challenge is to make sure that science is also at the table to inform the decisions. Now, all too often, science is not at the table for a variety of reasons. It's not available, it's not accessible, or it is, but it's not understandable. Or it's not obviously relevant, or it's not credible. And so this is a pretty high bar. To have science be available to inform decisions, it really needs to meet all of those criteria. So the question to us is, how do we do a better job of doing that? Now, I want to tell you a very short story about scientists interacting with decision makers. And this comes from my experience when I was administrator of NOAA. It was in the middle of our dealing with the Gulf oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. About a month into the spill, the president asked the vice president if he would please travel to the Gulf and talk with fishermen down there who were very, very concerned about what was happening and what their future would be. The vice president said, "I'm happy to do that, but I don't really know much about what we are doing in the Gulf with respect to fishing. I don't really know much about how oil affects fisheries, et cetera. So I need somebody who can brief me so that I can come up to speed and speak with some degree of knowledge about this." So the vice president's people asked my people if I would go down with him. So I said, of course. I had not interacted with the vice president much before this. I flew on Air Force Two with the vice president to the Gulf and briefed him on the plane and described to him how oil, hydrocarbons affect different types of life in the ocean differently, how it affects fish differently from shrimp and crabs, differently from oysters, what those effects were, how some of those species can cleanse themselves of oil, metabolize it, how others could not, how we were closing areas to fisheries where there was oil present or we expected oil to be present in the next 24, 48, 72 hours, and how we had developed tests to determine if seafood was contaminated, and that we would sample repeatedly and only open areas after repeated sampling had shown that it was not contaminated. So I was going through this description to him, and he stopped me, and he said, "I thought you were a scientist." And I said, "I am." And he said, "But I just understood everything you told me." And I thought, oh my goodness, what a condemnation of scientists this is. You know, here's a very distinguished politician who's been briefed umpteen billion times by scientists, and yet his impression of us is that he can't understand us. So I think that that's a real challenge to scientists to do what I call become bilingual, which is not only to speak the language of science, which we teach our students to do, but also for us and our students to speak the language of lay people and figure out how to do that translation. So that's a short story to underscore the importance of what we are talking about today. Now, there are multiple pathways for scientists to communicate with decision makers, and many of the different presenters on our panel today will talk about those different pathways. But I want you to keep in mind that this communication needs to be two-way. It's not just scientists filling up this empty vessel that is a decision maker with knowledge, and then he or she will automatically do what you would like them to do. It doesn't work that way. And so figuring out what another person knows, what a decision maker knows, so that you can connect from the known to the related unknown is really important. And the skills of listening and figuring out what is known and what's not known and what the real questions are is very much at the heart of what our panelists are going to be focusing on. So to be effective communicators, I think scientists really need to then understand not just the individual and his or her knowledge, but the culture and the values and the rhythms of the decision-making world. Now, that's a pretty tall order, and it underscores the importance of working with others who have that knowledge, be they people in agencies, academic scientists, practitioners, NGOs, people whom you trust, who can help bridge this gap so that you can be most effective in doing the communication that you would like to do. I emphasize the importance of knowing what others know and starting from there and go to another place. And I'll end with one other short story of an experience that I had at NOAA. NOAA's in the process of building the next generation of weather satellites. Weather satellites that are up in space, both those that NOAA runs as well as many of our partners, are functioning quite well. They provide over 90% of the data that go into the numerical weather models, and so are vitally important. The program to build the next generation of weather satellites had been in trouble when I came to NOAA for many, many, many years, and we had to fix it, fix the management structure, get it back on track. And then after doing so, I had to go to members of Congress and explain to them what we had done and why it was so important to fund these weather satellites. I went to one member of the House of Representatives and was describing to him what we had done, why these satellites were so important. And he just looked at me and he shook his head and he said, "Doctor, I don't need your weather satellites. I have the Weather Channel." I thought, whoops, I guess I better take a couple steps back and explain to him where the Weather Channel gets its information. And in the US, that's very much from NOAA. So knowing where, the level of knowledge of the person you're communicating with is really important. And sometimes that's not always an easy thing to know. So with that, Let me switch to introductions of our panelists. I'm going to call on Alan Simcock first. Mr. Simcock is now the joint coordinator for the UN group of experts that are preparing the World Ocean Assessment, the first one. Mr. Simcock has played numerous roles in both the UK government and in the UN system on international scientific assessments, most recently as the chair and the executive secretary of the OSPAR Commission for Protection of the Marine Environment of the Northeast Atlantic. He has a background in statistics and economics, and I think he's eminently well qualified to get us going on this panel. His focus is going to be on the World Ocean Assessment. So Alan, you're up. And I think you can do it from right there. We'll be sitting down for the panel.
The thing for changing the... I'm hoping someone is going to manage to put up the slides
Could we have the slides
yesterday.
for the...
Great.
Thank you. And I'm setting my timer.
Yes, I've set mine.
Okay? We'll have dueling timers here.
What I want to do today is to try and bring you up to speed on what is happening with the World Ocean Assessment. It is a novel effort. How successful we will be very interesting to see. We are getting to a very crucial stage because about the end of this month, we shall send out the first complete draft for comment by states and by a selected panel of peer reviewers. The questions I want to try and deal with are four. Why do we have this process? What did the UN General Assembly decide about it? Where have we got to? And what can we say about the implications for future research? Why a regular process? Well, I think the starting point is something that appeared in a UNET brochure about the process back in about 2007. If a business has its assets, it would be lunatic not to think of looking at the state of 7/10 of them. But the planet is 7/10 ocean, and we have not had any way of trying to take an overall integrated look at what is happening to the ocean. In 2002, the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg recommended that there should be, and this is our full official title, a regular process for global reporting and assessment of the state of the marine environment, including socio-economic aspects. The last three words are very important because sustainable development stands on a tripod of three legs: environment, social aspects, the economy. And what we're trying to do is to bring those three aspects together for the whole of the oceans. What the UN General Assembly has agreed on is a process to produce an integrated assessment of the oceans. Within that, a priority cross-cutting theme of food security. And this is intended to serve as a baseline for future assessments. It is intended to be a regular process. How regular that will be remains to be seen. The machinery you're probably not very interested in, but the governing body is something that represents all the states in the UN, all 200 or so of them, who want to take part. The group of experts, of which I'm one of the coordinators, is 22 people from around the world. We have a pool of experts, about 400, who are helping on specialized subjects. The UN Secretariat is providing a secretariat service, and the UN has approved guidance to contributors and a website. If you're interested in the website, it's very easy to find, worldoceanassessment.org. The issues we've been told to look at are basically in the four sections: ecosystem services, the food security question, the other human activities, and biodiversity and habitats. And we have obviously got supporting elements in it. Those are the 7 parts of our report. Where are we now? Well, we've drafted 58 chapters to cover those things. The summary is very nearly complete. I'm actually still working on it this week. It will go out, as I said, in December, and we hope that the process will end up with recommendations by midsummer next year and some conclusions by the UN General Assembly on where they will go by this time next year. The summary picks out 10 main themes on where we are going. There are a lot of problems with climate change. Marine biota, we have problems. Food security and safety is at risk. Biodiversity hotspots are magnets for human activities, and there is a contrast between the two. The major finding, I think, is that we have got, particularly in coastal areas, increased and conflicting demands for ocean space. We're still putting too much harmful material into the sea. Cumulative impacts are a key issue, and it's interesting to see the way in which that came up as a high-profile issue in what was said in the opening statement today. There is a very uneven distribution of benefits from the ocean around the world. We need integrated management, as we probably all know and agree, and that needs more and better information. And then the greatest threat is delay. We can't stop and do more research. We know that some solutions are possible. We need to get on with them. What are the implications for research? We need to promote dialogue between managers and scientists. The comment from our chair about scientists being difficult to understand as a perception is something that I think is very real. We have 1 or 2 chapters that are very difficult to understand, in spite of having asked for something that was written for non-experts. We need to be able to explain better and show how things are relevant. We need a framework for integration. How can we standardize all the many studies that are going on? This isn't a top-down measure. We have got to get scientists to feel that it makes sense to use the same approaches. And how can we compare studies between different parts of the world? There are at least 7 different regional methods of measuring the state of the marine environment, and they're incompatible. How can we try to make some way of doing it? How can we measure overall progress? And then how can we get more socio-economic aspects brought into the research? What difference does it make to people? As you will have heard from my bell, my 7 minutes are up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Our next speaker is Carol Turley. Carol is the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the UK Ocean Acidification Research Program, and she's at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. As an oceanographer and biogeochemist, she has a wealth of experience in both fundamental research as well as scientific assessments, both on the climate change front as well as ocean acidification, and also in the communication of science around both of those topics to the public and to policymakers at local levels, at national levels, and in international fora. Carol's going to focus today on what some of those lessons learned have been from communication about ocean acidification. Carol?
Thank you, Jane. It's all about bridging the gap between science and policy, and as you all know, scientists, we are a lot of scientists here, and we're on our hands and knees out in the field measuring things, and the policymakers are up at the top doing equally important things, and actually turning around and communicating with each other is a true challenge. My experience in the UK is that when you're bringing science to policymakers, they actually want to base their decision-making on pure science, on sound science. So you have to bring the evidence base. Sure, there are other things involved in the decision-making, but your role is to bring sound science to them. And how do you do that? You actually have to listen to them. You have to develop trust. You have to develop rapport. And science communication is two-way, and it's equally important to listen to what their needs are and learn from them, because they can actually enrich the science that you do and the science that you go back and do. I found that using a multi-pronged, multi-level approach really works. It's very helpful. I'm a little red dot down at the bottom. And if I just went through the food chain of science structure, it would be, and that was my only way of communicating knowledge upwards, it would take a long, long time to do it. So it's important for us scientists to put our heads above the parapet, go and talk to the chief scientific advisors, go and talk to government ministers, government departments, be part of expert working groups, stakeholder groups, advise NGOs, talk to the press and the public. But as you're doing this, you've got to be very careful that the information flow isn't misconstrued, isn't generalized too much, that you actually keep a handle on that communication too. So it's a balancing act, but multi-pronged, multi-directional inputs. One mad woman saying something isn't all that helpful. You need many people all saying similar messages to make the policymakers actually think there could be something in this. So it's like a virus, communication virus. And you need to reach the influencers and build trust and rapport. For example, members of parliament, chief scientific advisors, negotiation teams offer to give briefings, offer to read briefings. And why? Because they influence the decision makers. And similarly with journalists, you actually, it's really helpful to let them know where the key stories are and to offer to give interviews, but also to point them in the right direction of which scientists they should be talking, where the good communicators in the science fields are. And why? Because they influence the public, that influence the government and decision making. And Jane's quite right. You know, we speak in our very specialised language, and to really talk to policymakers, we need to adapt that language to make sure that we can communicate in a language that they understand. So we need to know our audience, and that's through building rapport and communication skills, and actually speak their language. So it is translation. And one thing we did in the ocean acidification community at the very start is we built a policy strand in at the start of research. We had stakeholders from industry, from policy, from NGOs all together working alongside the scientists. And there was exchange of knowledge, two-way again, two-way. And even they then helped us communicate the science to policymakers. So they helped us develop communication tools. And communication of ocean acidification science was really, truly an international effort. It started really with, the first report was the Royal Society report on ocean acidification. And then there have been great reports since then. And films and animations and all these communication tools. And you know, key reports and bulletins by the UN as well. But it's sharing this. We shared it amongst the community, and it was a community effort across national boundaries. We also realized early on that there were some difficult questions, that ocean acidification research is multidisciplinary, and one person cannot answer all the questions very knowledgeably. So we gathered those difficult questions that policy or media would ask us and went out to the experts in the international community and said, can you answer this? And then can you put it in a language that normal people can understand? And so we did that, and hence the FAQ was done, and then 20 facts simplified again as a communications tool. And we also shared that in other languages. You know, literally national languages as well as policy speak. And we really encourage scientists to contribute to really high-level UN documents. These are the influence documents. And IPCC, ocean acidification, really became part of that, especially in the last one. And the Convention on Biodiversity has brought out a second report on the impacts of ocean acidification on biodiversity. So it's really important to be involved in these, to put yourself forward. It is a lot of work, but it's important work. But don't stop there. When you've done something like that, take true advantage of what you've done. Inform the policymakers that these issues are being raised there. Inform the media that there's some really interesting stuff coming out of these reports. And this way you get better impact from the work that you've done. And if it's as important as ocean acidification is, and the ocean, other ocean stresses, then bring it to the attention of the UN. And this is what we did. A whole load of scientists, some of them are sitting in the room here, went to Copenhagen, the UNFCCC COP in Copenhagen, and have been there since, basically talking about the ocean stresses. And include VIPs. They can touch people that you can't even get in the same room with. And we mentioned school children earlier on. They are the next generation, but they're also incredibly good communicators themselves. They're the next policymakers and the next scientists, so talk to them. This is my last slide. I did a Google hit search back in 2003, and I got 17 hits on ocean acidification. I did it a couple of days ago, and it was nearly 2 million in under a second. So it has gone viral, but that said, only 20% of the UK general public know or have heard about ocean acidification. And then finally, if you're talking to policymakers, they have a short lifespan. So doing it once isn't enough. You have to do it again and again and again. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I think a number of great tips that we heard that are easily applicable to other arenas of communication. Our next speaker is going to be Neil MacDonald. He's the current Executive Scientific Secretary of the European Marine Board, and he's also a member of the senior management team of the European Science Foundation. He's a marine biologist by training. He's done research in aquaculture, fisheries, marine resource management, and has considerable experience in the management of international collaborative programs, research programs. He's going to focus specifically on communicating about oceans and human health. So Neil, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a slight issue with the presentation. So I'll get started and hope that the presentation and my slides appear. So I'm going to frame my opening message this morning around the whole area of oceans and human health. In 2013, my own organization, the European Marine Board, published a position paper called Linking Oceans and Human Health, a strategic research priority for Europe. And this paper was produced by an expert working group chaired by Professor Mike Moore from University of Plymouth and Peninsula Medical School in the UK. And the aim of the paper was to look at the real challenges of building and developing a research capacity to address, in Europe in particular, to address the major linkages and interactions between the marine environment on one hand and human health and well-being on the other, taking into account the major increase in coastal populations and in pressures on coastal seas. And this is where I really could do with my slides, because we have, as part of that process, produced a small graphic.
Mike, are we going to have access to the presentation?
I'll continue in any case. So one of the challenges with oceans and human health is that it is such a broad, it's a broad integrative meta-discipline. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
So that's just to show you the paper on the left, and all that is available for download from our website, marineboard.eu. So this is the schematic, and really it's trying to summarize something extremely complex into a very simple diagram, which we can use to try and at least communicate what we're talking about when we talk about oceans and human health. On the left-hand side, you have a range of benefits. On the right-hand side, you've got risks. In the center, you've got a sort of a stylized family, and representing the human element, and of course the circular aspect means that all of these issues are clearly interlinked and connected. These are not sitting separately. At the top, seafood has a dual risk in terms of, or a dual risk and benefit in terms of health benefits from eating seafood, but also risk of contamination of eating contaminated seafood. And then down the risk side, pollution, including chemical pollution, material pollution, and microplastics, biological hazards, marine-borne pathogens, harmful algal blooms, and also the risks from climate change, sea level rise, extreme weather events leading to coastal inundation and flooding and affecting people's livelihoods and so on. On the left, benefits. Ecosystem services, of course, everyone is familiar with the very broad range of ecosystem services and benefits which accrue to us from the oceans, and yet we still struggle to be able to put some kind of methodological value system on those benefits. The potential for new drugs to address human health issues through marine biodiscovery, and the whole area of health promotion through interacting with or living next to coastal environments, and that's a growing area of scientific study. The blue gym concept is being developed particularly in the University of Exeter in the UK. So to quote from the paper, many of our perceptions of the relationships between the marine environment and human health are still relatively unexplored, leaving knowledge gaps which are both scientific but also policy, relevant for policy and management. And that's the key point here. This is an area that we need to address these scientific, these complexities through research, but we also need to transfer that research to policy and management options and solutions. Just to give one very quick example, and I'm grateful to Richard Thompson, who's here somewhere, and he's provided me, from the University of Plymouth, he's provided me with a couple of slides on microplastics. So one of the pollutants which obviously has potential to impact not only on health of marine biota and marine environmental health, but also on human health. And this has been quite a success story. Richard and his team have done, were pioneers in the area of microplastics research. They coined the term and have achieved a lot of impact in the policy process and also through media, communicating through media. And one very strong impact is that marine litter, directly as a result of their science policy work, is included in the methodological standards and criteria for achieving good environmental status as part of the European Union Marine Strategy Framework Directive. That's a major EU directive on the marine environment. So just a slide to sum up. Issues which are general and issues which are related specifically to oceans and human health. So it's clear that for this particular very broad area, we need better integration across disciplines, and that topic has already been discussed today. We need social scientists, economists interacting with natural scientists. We need to bring particularly the health community to bear on addressing these issues. Those connections are still very weak. But I'd also translate that to the policy side. We need better integration across different policy sectors. It's not just the scientists who have to integrate across sectors. The science policy interface is obviously highly complex, and there's no one correct way. There are many different ways of achieving impact, and depending on the issue at hand and the impact required, structured versus very ad hoc, for example. The voice of one scientist or small group of scientists can make a difference. I think the microplastics example is very good for that. but there is also a need for knowledge synthesis and knowledge brokerage, where there is a huge body of knowledge and policymakers are faced with having to make decisions. They need some middle stage in the process to synthesize that knowledge and provide those options for them to assess in language that's easy for them to deal with. And finally, I think the IPCC is a very good example of that, of course. And finally, I think it's already been mentioned, it's all about people and building trust and relationship, understanding the motivations on both sides, and on all of those engaged in the science policy interface. If you understand the motivations of what the needs are of the person you're communicating to, you're much more likely to be able to communicate your message successfully. I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is David Vandersweg. He's the Canadian Research Chair in Ocean Law and Governance at Dalhousie, and he's a member of IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law. David has a diverse background and interests ranging from the environment and marine law to polar issues, and his topic this morning is going to be the multiple pathways for scientists to communicate cross-cutting challenges.
Thank you. Science and decision-making, in my mind, there's two images that capture this difficult and complicated relationship. One is tangled currents. I don't have a PowerPoint, so just think of tangled currents. There's not one way that science impacts decision makers. There's actually 5 major ways that science may relate. Now, I'll quickly run through those. One is informational science. And as we look at the posters downstairs, I think it's fair to say most of those are informational. It simply discusses again, is the CBD synthesis report on ocean acidification already mentioned. It lays out all the facts, the data gaps, but doesn't really get into policy recommendations. A second category of kind of science, you might call it, is basically recommendatory science. And this is where often you do get teams now of social and natural scientists working together to publish things that not only lay out the facts, but also get into recommendations, how we better strengthen governance. One example, last year in August, an article was published entitled Sustaining the American Eels, a Slippery Species for Science and Management, in volume 16 of the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy. What you had are scientists under the Ocean Tracking Network coming together, and you had all the natural scientists saying, look at the American eel. It's one big happy family all the way from Greenland down to Venezuela. It has major threats. It's now being considered for listing as threatened or endangered under the legislation in the U.S. and Canada. Major threats, thousands of dams, parasites, overfishing. A pound of the glass eels are worth over $2,000 U.S. They get shipped off to Asia. And it then went on to make policy recommendations. We'd have no bilateral U.S.-Canada cooperation on scientific cooperation, on management, and the broader region, there's no governance arrangement in place to deal with this broad region. So it suggested maybe the Sargasso Sea Commission, just set up this year, might take a lead and develop the governance framework. Very quickly, the third category is advisory science. Decision makers actually do often ask for advice. So we heard from Jane a very interesting direct example. But if you look in the scientific or the fisheries management field, it's very common at national level and regional fisheries management organizations for scientific advice to be requested. And of course, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change internationally, which gives advice on climate change. And we just had the 5th assessment report this year. It basically calls for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 70% from 2010 levels by 2050, and to eventually reduce our emissions down to near zero or even below by 2100. So the assessment report that just came out, the synthesis report, actually made policy recommendations to governments. The fourth category very quickly is advocacy science. Scientists can be advocates, and we do see many examples of that. At the national level, it's very common to have environmental impact assessment processes, court cases that come along, for example, where to site, or should we site an offshore wind farm, and scientists do get involved. Some represent perhaps industry, trying to minimize what the impacts will be. Other scientists come in and say, well, it's going to affect marine mammals and the noise impacts, those kind of things. And science also can come up in the international situation. Just this year in March, the International Court of Justice handed down a decision on the international whaling case brought by Australia versus Japan. Japan was undertaking large, lethal taking of whales, particularly in the Southern Ocean, and some scientists were representing Japan in the case before the World Court, saying, well, you know, we need to kill whales to actually study them appropriately, and we do publish quite a bit of the results. Australian scientists brought in by Australia went the other way and said, well, you know, we really don't have to take whales and kill them to study them, and really there's very little peer-reviewed science coming out. So there's an International Court of Justice case where scientists really became kind of advocates. The final category is decisional science. And again, I think people don't realize that there are cases where scientists actually, in fact, become decision makers. I'll give you 2 examples from the United States. This is not prevalent, by the way. Most countries, most governments do not want to give scientists the final say. They really want to keep the political discretion that Jane mentioned, to have social economic factors, political factors come in. But just 2 examples from the United States. Jane already mentioned the Magnuson-Stevens amendments of the Fisheries Act in the U.S. in 2006. What the U.S. did at that time, they said from now on, fishery management councils must follow the scientific advice of their committees set up to give that advice, and you can't exceed the total allowable catch recommended by these scientific committees. So there you go. Science becomes really decision-making. The other example would be the U.S. Endangered Species Act, where there, the listing of endangered species, again, it has to be based on the best available science. Social economics, loss of jobs should not come in the listing decision. Very quickly, I think I have a minute and a half yet.
Yep.
Exactly?
Yep.
The second image, very quickly, is rough waters. Rough waters. And I just want to flag some of the 5 quick challenges, and some of these have come up already. One is confronting the limited financing and human resources to support scientific research. Obviously, that's come up before. For example, in 2014, FAO members reported to the Committee on Fisheries of the FAO that 54% said only 54% of the FAO members said we have adequate scientific personnel to give the data in support of fisheries management that we need. Getting scientists to speak out, and to speak out in common lay language, I think, is a second key challenge. Maintaining the independence and free expression of science is another one that I would mention. For example, in Canada, a recent poll was undertaken through public servants, and hundreds of them said, look, we're muzzled. We can't speak out right now under the present government and give scientific information very freely. Our information gets censored before it goes to the media. So there's a major problem, even in a developed country like Canada now, where you can have political interference with the science. Putting the precautionary approach into practice, this has become a nightmare situation around the globe, both nationally and in regional fisheries management organizations. Very often you do get high quotas being established, even when we don't have adequate scientific information. And you also have the overriding of scientific advice again and again, or the ignoring the scientific advice again and again. It happens particularly related to tuna management, and many examples can be given. And finally, implementing the ecosystem approach. It's a common buzzword. We need integrated management, but we're still a very long way from implementing the words into actions. And I could go on for an hour there, but I won't, and maybe we can leave that for more for discussion. Thank you.
So I really appreciate the panelists sticking to their allotted time, so we have a good chunk of opportunity for all of you to pose questions. Let me get the ball rolling by focusing on something that David touched upon, which is scientific integrity and scientific integrity within government agencies specifically. And just invite the panelists to reflect on what they have seen that actually works in ensuring that the scientific advice that is going to the decision makers within governments through their government scientists is in fact science that we would all have comfort in and believe in, that hasn't been manipulated or suppressed or cherry-picked or distorted. So any reflections on that from any of the panelists? Neil?
I don't know if I can give a sort of an example, but I just want to maybe give an interesting result from a survey which we were involved in, which addresses this issue a few years ago. So as part of a CLAMOR project, which is an EU FP7 project, addressing the impacts of climate change on the marine environment, but specifically what the scientific community knows and understands with respect to these impacts, and how that differs from what the public knows and understands, and also what policymakers know and understand. So it was addressing that gap. And one of the tasks within this was to carry out a survey on public perceptions of a range of marine environmental issues. But also within there was a question about trust. And the interesting result that came out was that in terms of the order of trust, and this was 10,000 people polled in 10 European countries, so it's quite a big base. The highest level of trust in terms of the scientific was placed in scientists based in academic institutions. And next in the list came scientists in government institutions, and so on down. But academic institutions maintain that, in the perception of the public, maintain that sort of complete transparency and independence and high level of integrity. That is at the highest level. And I think it was that they have a party line to toe, or that they're come under scrutiny there. That's not to say these are actually true, that's just the perception, and I thought that was an interesting result.
David?
Well, obviously, government policies hopefully should leave for open communication of science. That's the starting point. I think the other takes on this is that this is where also I think academic scientists come in, which we hope will be less constrained, not always the case, because they may have funding that comes in and relies on somehow maybe not being totally transparent. Scientists working with NGOs, I think, is another very creative way that you also see more free transmission of science. Scientists who retire, there's many examples of that, where they then feel free to speak out. Very recently, been quite a few editorials in Canadian newspapers on scientists who retired criticizing the government for closing down science programs that they didn't like because it was going to indicate maybe problems that the government had to deal with. So I think there are many factors that come into play to deal with the issue.
Jane,
Yep, Carol?
we had a similar study in the UK about public perception, and it was totally, the most trusted were independent scientists, and the least trusted were policymakers, politicians. And these are the people we're trying to communicate with. So you talked about integrity, and that is something, that is our only line of defense, is integrity. So we must maintain that. So it is a fine balancing act on what message you bring, and making sure that that is a well-balanced message, because if you lose your integrity, you lose your trust, and therefore your means of communication. So maintaining integrity is hugely important.
Helen?
I think I'd like to draw attention to a slightly different question of trust. There's been reference to the problem of fisheries management and the way in which fisheries quotas have been set well above what scientific research has supported. But there is a problem if the scientific research is not accepted by the people who are going to have to be bound by those quotas. In the North Sea, there was a long period when the fishermen just did not believe the answers that the scientists were giving to the question of what were the limits on fishing if you were going to maintain the stocks. And it took an initiative by a local authority, Aberdeenshire County Council, which is where a large part of the UK's fishing industry is based, involving similar bodies all round the North Sea and bringing fishermen and fisheries scientists together to re-establish some trust that the data that the scientists were giving was actually something that you could trust and work on. The fishermen were taking the view that they knew better than the scientists because they saw what was happening in the sea. How far that was self-induced belief in a state that they would like but wasn't actually the case is difficult to judge. But there is a real problem if you have a conflict between the scientific advice and what the people who are going to be affected by that scientific advice think is the case. And a policymaker is not happy being put between those two jaws of a clamp. Thank you.
We can tell you speak from experience. I'd like to open it up to the floor now. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then have sort of merged responses. So let's start right over here, since the microphone is there. Phil? And please stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Phil Williamson from the UK Natural Environment Research Council. We haven't heard very much about the role of the media, and Carol mentioned it to some degree, but that's the main sort of interface for the public and their information that they receive, and the way that the media can be very beneficial, very, very positive, but can also have perhaps benign influences, or having various filtering, various exaggeration, and in what is any best advice of how to have the influence and to try and get a friendly media and to try and get messages across. I don't know whether this meeting is being reported very much, whether or not there's any sort of science highlights that are coming out, but I think to reach the public at large, there's the popular media, but also the specialist media as well.
Thanks, Phil. Okay, are there any questions over here? Yes, one here, please.
Yeah, my name
Please
is Rafael
stand
Sarda. I'm local. I come from the National Council of Research. I wanted to do the question to Ms. Bandy before, but it can be well addressed to you also. In my institution, I have one person that years ago he went to work for National Geographic. His name is Enrique Sala, probably many of you knows, and right now he's much more popular and doing much more things for saving the oceans than maybe many scientists. Of course, with science knowledge behind. My question is basically, if you go to the political world, if you go to the business community, even if you go to the climate change clubs or other clubs that are done with issues around global change, you will find plenty of what is called think tanks. And maybe in science, I know that maybe it's a provocative question, but maybe in science it's time that some of the well-reputed names we have in science, many of them are just here, left science, go away from scientific projects, try to make think tanks, a network of global think tanks, leave science for younger people, and try to pass the message in a much more activism way. Talking about the media, I have been following the media here in Catalonia for during the week, and I had only half a page in La Vanguardia on Monday, and nothing in the TV, as far as I know. But the other guys, the guys of the cancer that are here, were in TV during these days. So I think that it's time to go. I don't know if this is the 5th category of science that you select, but make think tanks, live science, work with the science you have, or work with the science we have, and be activists from another point of view. I'm amazed that there is very few people from NGOs in this conference, and maybe they are doing also a better job to protect oceans with our knowledge, of course, but they are doing much more work to do to save the ocean that we do. So my proposal is that maybe some scientists should leave the work in science, go to do think tanks, to be activists, to be much more influential people, try to be as independent as you can, and instead to do reports, just to go to talk with the other stakeholders directly.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Thank you very much. One over here. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Biran Samb. I am regional coordinator of Canary Current Large Marine Ecosystem. I have 2 points. One, it is related to the role of media. I think that it is very important, the media, because in our region, in Northwest Africa, during many years, we tried to communicate with policy makers, and it was not very successful. But when we have the depletion of the main target species, this debate came on the table, and the media begin to start and things. And the professional organization of fishermen use the scientific results that we get from our working group and use it like a plenary and talk with the authorities in order to avoid the fishing agreement with foreign vessels. And actually, some pressure had been stopped or reduced due to the fact that it increased with the media. We have an increase of awareness of the public, and it will help the politician. And it is a stem that scientists talk to the media talk to the public and the authorities, and it will help to increase the awareness. And the second point, it is about the ecosystem approach to fisheries. We try to apply it in our region, and I think that we are in a good way, because in our region, fishery is very important, and we have stock shared between many countries. And what we have done, it is to apply ecosystem approach to fisheries. We invite the administration, the scientists, the professional, and we made the whole step, which is to have a report about the state of reference. We identify together all the issue, we rank it, we do what we had era workshops, and we arrive to define the operational objective for management. And actually we put on place, but it is not effective, but it is, we have actually a draft about the regional management plan and to share this stock, which is very important for our region. Like, you know, in the Canary Current, we have about 3 million of catches of fish in this region, and we have a lot of fishermen. And I think that to share this stock, it will be very important to imply all stakeholders, and fish and ecosystem approach on fisheries is actually in implementation, and we hope that the country will adopt this management plan elaborated at the level of, at the regional level. And I think it was the 2 points that I want to indicate.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we have 3 different questions. Panelists, hang on right there. We'll be with you in just a minute. We're going to invite responses from the panelists. Role of media, role of think tanks, and engagement of broad groups of stakeholders, especially around the topic of ecosystem-based management of fisheries at the regional scale. So, any comments, Alan?
If I could start focusing on the media, I think it's very important to remember that the media are interactive with their audience. We're in a period when media are subject to enormous change. The social media that are emerging are changing the world quite noticeably. And a lot of what we think about the media is probably becoming out of date because we are so much fixed on television, newspapers, and so on. Because of the importance that media are reacting, it's worth thinking about the way in which that reaction is controlled. The UK Department of Health about 10 years ago produced a very interesting paper on the way in which people react to stories. They identified what they called the 10 fear factors, the things that make people worried. can they control what's happening? Is it to the benefit of someone other than themselves? Is this something that is run by multinational companies or local people, and so on? And then on top of those fear factors, the media multipliers. And there were 4 particular media multipliers, and this, as I say, is in the context of the more traditional media. The first is that the media will report a fight. If there's agreement that something is the case, they're not very interested. It's not a good story. But if you've got 2 people slogging it out, or 2 groups slogging it out, it's much more interesting. The second media multiplier is sex. Certainly in Western Europe, that sells newspapers. Whether that is the case in other parts of the world may be more doubtful, but there's no doubt that in Western Europe, sex is a media multiplier. Can you twist the story so that there is a sex element in it? The third is scandal. It's very much better if you can throw some mud at someone and say that they are fleecing the public or undermining the public. Unless there's something you can do like that, the media, again, are not going to be very interested. And the fourth, again, for the traditional media, is very much the relationship between them and their advertisers. Traditional media, and I suspect also to some extent the social media, are dependent on advertising revenue. And they're not going to want to have things that will put off their advertisers, because that's a way of cutting their own throats. So that I think in thinking about how the media work, you have to think about those sorts of issues. They're also important in questions of mass movements. The fear factors and to some extent the media multipliers will affect the way in which large groups of people react. And again, it's worthwhile thinking about how any message you're trying to put across fits against those sorts of analyses. On the question of...
So you have to make it short.
Yes, I won't talk about think tanks then.
Okay. Other responses, and let's keep these short so we can maximize our interactions. Neil?
Yeah, just a couple of points on the role of the media. Again, it depends on the issue, and I think with the slide I showed earlier and the work by Richard Thompson and the media articles and exposure they gained in terms of microplastics, that was a sort of low-hanging fruit. It was something that they were able to really get media interest. Another interesting sort of story is the use of the media in terms of, well, in the UK there is a TV chef called Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall. He's quite famous on UK TV. Very strong on the issue of sustainable fisheries and food production. And he began a campaign to address the issue of discards in EU fisheries. And his goal was to basically get a ban on discards under the Common Fisheries Policy. And he collected a huge, through a media or campaign and through using his own profile, he collected a very large number of names on a petition and took that to Brussels. And basically, to cut a long story short, was successful in the sense that a phasing out of discards was agreed in the last review of the Common Fisheries Policy. So that shows on a very particular issue, which public also can relate to, that you can be very successful using this type of media campaigns. And on the flip side, we've been involved in various attempts to use the media to publicize various scientific issues based on information and knowledge coming out of marine science over the number of years. And we've gone so far as to use media expert consultants, and we've used Terry Collins, who was the media consultant for the Census of Marine Life. And I mean, Terry did a great job working with a group of scientists that we were managing this process, putting together various press releases, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but two things I think that I would like to say coming out of that. The first was the difficulty in agreeing some of the the actual media articles themselves. A lot of the scientific work groups that we were using as the sort of expert reference points became rather uncomfortable with some of the sensationalization that was necessary. Terry understandably says you need a hook. We need something that's strong that people are going to pick up on if we're going to get this story to catch on in media outlets around the world. But of course, that results sometimes in a dumbing down of information, which makes scientists feel uncomfortable. The second thing is, I'm not sure of the impact. And in fact, we've no way, or we at least, I'm not saying we've no way, but we certainly didn't have the capacity to measure whether, and some of those media campaigns were very successful. So we got a lot of media coverage, but we don't know if that actually translated then through to any, let's say, shift in policy and thinking among decision makers. And that's something we've to work out a system of measuring that impact. Thank you.
Carol?
Thanks, Jane. With regard to media, the story is all important. And one of the things with ocean acidification was once they'd done it once, because the science was, certainly the chemistry was so clear, they, when you go back and revisit them in a year's time, say, you know, shouldn't you do another story about ocean acidification? They say, well, we've done it. And so it's the issue. There aren't people knocking themselves over the head. They're not debating it, and it's not being as well attacked by deniers as perhaps climate change. So that whole antagonistic aspect is missing, so perhaps less attractive for reporters. But there are reporters out there that actually see the seriousness of it and want to report it. And very interesting for the Convention on Biodiversity report last month. Within the report, it had a figure of $1 trillion, which was the value at 2100 of loss of coral reefs. That was the economic annual value. And that showed that money talks. It traveled the world, this figure. It changed considerably on the way to 2 trillion starting now, you know, that the impacts are now. So it changed, and you've got to realize that the message that in your press release will be altered. It can be altered, and you sort of have to accept that. It's also important to have these hooks, like the ocean acidification community have come up with the other CO2 problem, the evil twin to climate change, the silent storm because you can't see it, hear it, or smell it. You know, all these things are actually have to attract the media attention. Nemo, can it find its way home? You know, ways that the media can actually hook the public. So it is difficult. And I mean, I have a very short story where I put my head above the parapet at an international climate change conference and gave a talk on ocean acidification. It was one organized by Tony Blair back in 2005. And I knew the BBC. I've been working with the BBC to do a documentary on that and news items for that to go out on the BBC News. But the newspapers didn't actually pick up on the story until the BBC went out that evening and that day. And so then I came back in the next morning and was inundated with requests from the newspaper media for interviews. And I was pretty inexperienced, so I went down into where the press were corralled, because they're often corralled and treated very badly. And I essentially gave my talk again to them, and then closed my laptop up, and they were trying to press me, well, is this the end of the world? Is this the end of life in the ocean and everything? And I kept very clear messages. And I'd finished, so I got up and wiped my brow, and I said, of course, don't you guys go reporting that there'll be no more fish and chips. And they said to me, that's your career gone. And that was off the record, or at least I thought it was off the record, as I was walking out the door. And the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian all had pictures of jellyfish and chips, right? And then, fortunately, my science colleagues forgave me and sent me all these recipes for jellyfish. So really be careful about what you say as well, because it can sting you.
So we're going to do a lightning round of final questions and then final responses. So be very, very quick in your comments. Right here, please.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Xiaojun from Taiwan. I think the difficulty of marine policy making is not only the gap between scientists, society, and the policymaker, but also between countries. So how to reduce the gap between nations and build an international framework to make a better marine policy?
Thank you. Great question. Right back over here, we'll pick this one up. Go ahead and do that, and then we'll go back to her. Yep. Okay.
Okay, thank you. This follows on Carol's intervention a moment ago.
Is that Manuel? Can you stand up, please?
Yes, Manuel Baranja, Plymouth Marine Laboratory. I wonder if the panel could reflect on a couple of events that have happened recently. The first one is that the European Commission has scrapped the chief scientists. And conversations yesterday, without mentioning people or countries, I know of another country whose department chief scientist is not going to be replaced. And I just wonder whether chief scientists have become too difficult to handle, and that this perception that politicians and policymakers want advisors next to them has suddenly backfired, with politicians being uncomfortable with the advice that is being given to them, or particularly pressure groups putting pressure on the politicians not to listen to scientific advice.
Okay, yes, right back here. Please, stand up.
Hi, I'm Yvonne Walter. I'm chair of the IC Science Committee. The communication process is a bit problematic for us. We're a bunch of scientists that want to commit to the ecosystem approach, and we're kind of frustrated in our communication with managers and policies because we have a lot of answers, but we don't have any questions. So our approach right now is to play a game of Jeopardy and trying to get the managers and policymakers on board. We give the answers and you ask the questions. Actually, we're doing this right now. We're trying to get out a number of proactive advice out of the science that we commit to the ecosystem approach, but we still need to get the managers and policymakers on board for this game of Jeopardy. So I'm just asking you, do you want to play a game of Jeopardy on ecosystem-based management? We're willing to play, and can you help me in this process? Thank you.
Great question. One more over here, please.
My name is Gail Oshirenko. I'm from the University of California at Santa Barbara. I wanted to ask Dr. Lubchenko, maybe to follow up on the story that you told at the beginning. This question comes from my filmmaker colleagues who asked me this just as I was leaving to come to Barcelona. What policy changes have actually occurred due to the science that was drawn from the Deepwater Horizon?
Okay, we have great questions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do justice to all of them. Apologies to those of you who still have hands up. We need to stay on time here, and I think we'll have ample opportunity for some informal conversations the next few days. I would like to invite the panelists to each do a final round and incorporate into that responses to the questions we've heard, as well as any other final reflections that they may have. And in particular, each of you is working on a specific thing that you put before us, whether it's ocean acidification or human health or the World Ocean Assessment, for example. What are your reflections on those, that particular activity through the lens of some of the things that you've heard now. Are there different ways you're thinking about it? Are there some new opportunities? How do we make sure, for example, that the World Ocean Assessment is effective enough that policymakers are going to want a second one? How do we make sure it has real resonance? What's the communication strategy, just to pick on you, Alan? And let me just say that the very specific question that was asked about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we still don't know completely the full impacts of the spill on the ecosystem. The court proceedings are continuing in terms of the government's case against the responsible parties. That's not been finalized, and there are a lot of studies underway to figure out what kinds of policy changes and management changes, regulatory changes are needed in response to the spill. So it's a work in progress. There have been some changes, but there, I think, are more that are needed. But that process has not yet come to fruition. So, Carol, let's start with you.
Manuel, I didn't know that the EU Commission of Scrap Chief Scientists, that is truly bad news. I certainly hope that doesn't feed its way down to the UK, because I think the chief scientists in the UK can play a big role. It depends on which, who's in government, how much influence they have. Perhaps some governments take heed of chief scientists less than others. It very much depends on the viewpoint of the current government and what their policy needs are, and sometimes science is not part of their agenda, which is very difficult for us then. In terms of communications, I believe that it's all down to human interactions. I mean, that's what we do, we communicate. And I really believe communication is a two-way process based on relationships and networks, and sharing our knowledge is hugely important. Sharing across national boundaries. If you've got a good communicator, say in the States, you need to tell your scientist, your policymaker or your member of the press to go and talk to that person there. So you actually internationalize the issue straight away rather than holding it to yourself. You put it out and you make many, many spokespeople on an issue like ocean acidification.
Thank you. Alan?
I think I'd like to take up the question of the relationships between scientific institutions and government policy making. It is very clearly very different in different parts of the world. It's very easy within the North American, European context to think that we understand it. It's complex enough there. But when you look at the different relationships in South America, in the Far East and so on, you have very different expectations of what will happen and very different ways in which those relationships take place. This has had its influence on the World Ocean Assessment, in that one of the things that was made very clear to us was that we were not to make any recommendations about policy or even evaluate policy. We were to provide, quotes, facts, and the decision makers would interpret those as they thought fit into conclusions. It's impossible to avoid that just in the language you choose and so on, but we are very clear that we have been told we must not make recommendations, and that comes from some of the backgrounds of many of the countries on their relationships between science and government. I think the real problem in many fields is a wish by scientists to hold back on comments on their conclusions. Working through large numbers of research papers, you end up with a conclusion that, yes, you now understand better how much of this chemical is found in this particular fish. But why that is so, what that implies, and so on. In a large number of countries, I think people hold back from making conclusions that might imply criticism or anything. It's easier to stay within the very narrow science. And that is partly for career reasons, but given the structures, partly because of the training that you shouldn't go beyond your field. There isn't a universal relationship, and we have to live with that. It will certainly be an interesting question whether there is a World Ocean Assessment too. I very much hope that we will produce something that will make people think that it is worth doing. We have the commitment that this should be a regular process. We can only just hope that it's slightly more regular than the International Ocean Research Conferences, where the gaps between them are quite long. The risk is that we would, if we don't do it again in 5 or 7 years, the knowledge about how we've done it and what the problems are will have been lost, and it will be a continuous process of starting from scratch. Thank you.
Neil?
Okay, 3 points just to finish up. Firstly, with respect to the abolition of the position of chief scientist at the EU, and I believe this sends out a very bad signal. Regardless of, I mean, the position is quite new. It was only established in 2012, and so to so quickly remove that position is not a good signal for the role of science in influencing EU policy. I believe that the alternative proposed is that the President of the European Commission proposes setting up of a European Political Strategy Centre, but how that replaces the Chief Scientific Advisor position or role, I have no idea. But I do believe that whether it's through a Chief Scientific Advisor or an Office of Science and Technology, which has a full-time staff available to provide science and technology synthesis and information, is very important for any sort of political governance system. And so I think that's a very retrograde step. In terms of, just to bring it back to my opening comments and the whole issue of oceans and human health, I think one of the things that can probably, I mentioned the fact that we're still lacking very much the engagement, particular of the health community, and to achieve that very broad interdisciplinary approach. I think one of the things we need to do is to widen the evidence base for these impacts. We need more data, facts and figures on disease burden and even on economic benefit. So for example, there's a UNEP figures which show that or estimate that there is approximately 4 million person years lost annually as a result of illness from bathing in gastrointestinal illness from bathing in contaminated water. So these kind of figures can be very powerful, and we need some more of those. Final comment in terms of, and also linking back to the chief scientist issue, is something I would bring under the whole term of word of leadership. So science policy interface and connecting with policy and influencing policy is a very complex landscape. But I think one of the most powerful tools we have is to use the best people we have. People who are excellent communicators, who have the standing within the scientific community and also outside that community, to provide leadership in speaking, in advocacy, and in speaking on some of these key issues. And importantly, we have to free time up for those people to take on that role. And I think the more of those people we have, the more impact we can have.
Thank you. David, very briefly.
Yeah, 2 final points. One, picking up on the gap issue amongst some countries, perhaps lagging in policy development related to coastal and oceans. That raises really, again, I think, a capacity development issue. And my own impression is that over the years, we've been seeing, I think, a pullback by many countries in their support for international capacity development in that area. And again, you know, you think about the number of programs, probably put them on a couple hands. International Ocean Institute has about 35 years now, having an 8-week program that deals with ocean law and policy governance with students from around the world. Korea just began last year a new Academy in Law of the Sea, or this year, Academy in Law of the Sea, 45 students from around the globe looking at ocean governance issues. So I think we need to really scale up in that area. And again, I guess the other part of this is, you know, Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, is now pushing marine spatial planning. Again, that hopefully will begin to trickle down into other countries around the globe as a major approach. But again, there's questions of political will, which are difficult around the globe. My final point, really more of a general nature, to me, sustaining our seas is going to take much more than sound science or more science. And I think we really have to come to grips with some really major needs for major law reforms, ocean governance reforms. And just quickly, a couple examples. Globally, we clearly, I think, need an implementation agreement on areas beyond national jurisdiction, protecting marine biodiversity there. UN will come up next year for decision. Hopefully the right decision will be made. It's still very political. We've been fighting over it for almost a decade. So it's not a done deal yet, and some hesitancy. If you look at chemicals management, again, I'm very dissatisfied where we are. We have a Stockholm Convention. Many governments think the chemicals issue is taken care of. We now regulate 23 chemicals for elimination or restriction. Well, guess what? There are over 70 million chemicals that have been created or discovered. Not all those are commercially out there, but we get about 1,000 new chemicals a year. We discovered already 300 chemicals with accumulation potentials in the Arctic. So we haven't solved the issues, and we really need to take a much more precautionary approach. I think a new chemicals convention down the line, but no one's talking about it. No one wants to talk about it. Just a couple examples. Then finally, nationally, we really have to legalize marine spatial planning, integrated planning that hasn't occurred in many countries, and we have to mandate the following of precautionary ecosystem approaches. Right now, it's mostly soft law in most countries, nice buzzwords, but we don't have the legal mandates. And I could go on an hour about Canada, how we have an old Fisheries Act that hasn't been modernized yet, to have beyond political discretion when you set your licensing restrictions. We need principles in the rule of law to apply, not just political discretion. And that's a big issue around the globe. I could go on for another hour, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I am bringing this session to a close with my thanks to the panelists and to all of you. But before we adjourn, we're going to invite Niall McDonough to give us just a very short report from the European science community on the Rome Declaration. Niall?
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes because I'm sure everyone is gasping for coffee. I'll avoid the slides. Very simply, maybe the slides will appear, but in any case, a month ago in Rome, we had a conference called the EuroOcean 2014 conference. That's a conference we hold as part of a series every 3 to 4 years, which is a major marine science policy conference. It tracks scientists, policymakers, funding agencies, civil society, a whole range of stakeholders. Apart from being an interesting conference in itself, the EuroOcean series, since back in 2004, has started to publish what we call declarations. And these are statements of the major issues and challenges that on behalf of the marine science community we feel deserve attention in terms of funding, the funding and support and coordination in the next 5 to 10 years. So this process takes about 6 months to a year from before the conference. So we don't just make up the declaration during the conference. We arrive there having done months of work and very broad stakeholder consultation with a draft. And then during the conference, we discuss that openly, we take comments, and we make final changes. And we made a lot of changes during the course of the conference. The declaration looks like this. There is still some left. There is a pile inside the door here. I don't think I have enough. I've packed enough in my suitcase for everybody, but they are available in any case on the EuroOcean 2014 website, euroocean2014.eu, and will be translated into 22 EU languages. And it includes 4 goals. Again, with no time to go into them, but I'll just list them. Valuing the ocean. It's promoting a wider awareness and understanding of the importance of the ocean in everyday lives of European citizens, and of course that's a global issue for those non-European Europeans here. For Europe in particular, building on our strengths to reinforce Europe's position as a global leader in marine science and technology, fundamental need to continue to advance our ocean knowledge. We need more. We need to address a range of big research challenges in terms of understanding our ocean system and how it is changing, and the impacts of those changes. And finally, breaking barriers, not just interdisciplinarity, not just across scientific disciplines, but across policy barriers, cultural, political, and so on. And this includes very much issues related to training. So that's the Rome Declaration. Please, if you have time, take a copy and have a look at it. And we're hoping that, and we normally do with this document, get very good success in terms of how it feeds through to funding in the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate the panel and audience attention. Luis, do you have any announcements for us?
So you can put the slides, please. Before you go to the coffee break, I would like to make the today announcements. So again, if you have the opportunity to tweet something about this conference, you have the directions there. And please keep this slide at any time before to start the session tomorrow morning and at the end and so on. So next slide.
Sorry.
So today, just to remember that we have one side event at lunch time, and some bags with a light lunch will be delivered there. So it's a really interesting side event on the adventure of Nansen. So this was an amazing guy, and now they are developing this capacity building program since the last 40 years, and they are building a new ship. So it's a very interesting side event. Just to remind you that we have the poster session this afternoon, and the authors with the yellow tag has to be in front of the poster just to defend it for any question from the other participants. And also remind that the Blue Cocktail is happening today. It will be in the Museum Maritime in the downtown, and there are shuttle buses departing from here to go there. If you are in another different hotel, you have to go by your own means, and you have the direction I think in the Book of Asters. Otherwise, just ask in the reception desk. So I think that those are the main messages for today. In terms of lunches, you know very well now the area. You can go to the Museu Blau or to the Commercial Center or other restaurants around. Just to keep this slide a bit in here, just to remind you the things. And please do not forget to tweet the things about the